Blake Monroe was 68 years old when life showed her a void she had never imagined. After 42 years of marriage, she had just buried Jake, her lifelong partner, the man with whom she had shared simple routines, fleeting arguments, and comfortable silences that only build over the years. The house in Tennessee had become a museum of memories. The coffee cup always left on the table, the rocking chair in which Jake used to read the newspaper, even the sound of the wind blowing through the windows reminded her that he was no longer there. The loneliness weighed so heavily that even breathing seemed like an effort. In the midst of this fragility, Mark, her only son, appeared with an offer that seemed like a relief. Together with his wife, Tanya, they spoke to her about a healing trip, assuring her that it would be a way to escape the grief and give her mind a break. Blake, still heartbroken but trusting in her family's good faith, accepted without question. She didn't want to be seen as a burden. She even decided to sell some of her most valuable jewelry gifts Jake had given her on anniversaries and special occasions to help with the travel costs. She did it as a gesture of gratitude, convinced that she was still an essential part of that family and that the trip would be a sign of unity in difficult times. On the day of the trip, Blake arrived at the airport with a mixture of nerves and hope. She had packed a small carry-on bag with the essentials, trusting that Tanya would handle the larger suitcases as she had insisted. She thought that, although the pain of Jake's absence was still raw, at least sharing those days with her son would give her some relief. However, as she approached the airline counter, she noticed something odd. She only had a one-way ticket in her name, with no return, and there was no sign of her checked luggage. Confusion made her tremble. She looked around for Tanya, waiting for a reasonable explanation. The answer came with a coldness that cut like a knife. Tanya, with a calculated gesture, told her there was no return ticket and that she would have to figure it out on her own when she wanted to return. Mark, silent, just nodded, avoiding direct eye contact. Amid the bustle of the airport, Blake felt like her entire world was crumbling beneath her feet. It wasn't just the humiliation of being left behind. It was the confirmation that the trust she had placed in them had been betrayed in the cruelest way. For a moment, the sound of rolling suitcases, loudspeaker announcements, and surrounding conversations seemed to disappear. Blake stood stock still, his heart racing, trying to understand how his own son could allow such a thing. He'd sold a lifetime's worth of mementos, jewelry steeped in history, only to be discarded as worthless. He didn't cry then, though his throat burned. Instead, he clutched the purse he'd been wearing, knowing inside was the one resource no one could take away from him, an envelope of money he'd secretly stashed away in the business card of the family's old lawyer. If you're reading this and have ever felt that unexpected betrayal from someone who was supposed to be looking out for you, leave your support in the comments. This space is here to remind us that we are not alone. With her back straight and her pride wounded, Blake left the airport without looking back. She didn't want to beg. She didn't want to demand explanations from those who had already made their opinions clear. Outside, the air seemed heavier, and each step she took carried with it a mixture of suppressed rage and profound sadness. She walked to a nearby bench, took a deep breath, and opened her purse. There was that envelope of carefully tucked away bills and the yellowed business card of the lawyer who had once helped Jake with the family's legal matters. It was as if Jake had unwittingly left her a map to avoid getting completely lost. It wasn't long before she took a taxi straight to the office. During the ride, as she watched the city pass by the window, Blake felt the tears she'd been holding back begin to fall silently. They weren't tears of defeat, but of pain that was slowly turning into determination. Instead of returning to an empty house and sinking into loneliness, she decided that this day would mark a turning point. She would no longer allow herself to be treated like a burden. She would use that wound to protect what she had left and give her life new meaning. The lawyer, a man with gray hair and a steady gaze, greeted her respectfully and unhurriedly. He listened to every detail, from Jake's recent death to her abandonment at the airport. Blake, her voice trembling but determined, explained that she didn't want cheap revenge. She wanted justice and, above all, to ensure that her legacy didn't end up in the hands of those who had treated her like trash. The lawyer nodded and, after reviewing the documents, explained that she had every right to modify the will and legally record what had happened as a case of financial and emotional abuse. Blake signed each page with a hand that still refused to tremble. With each stroke of the pen, she felt she was regaining a piece of her dignity. Mark and Tanya, who had believed she would always be the fragile and dependent widow, were officially excluded from her inheritance. Instead, she decided to allocate her assets to Elder Haven, an institution dedicated to supporting elderly victims of family abandonment and exploitation. It wasn't an improvised decision. It was a conscious act of transforming betrayal into concrete help for those who, like her, had felt the sharp edge of contempt on their own skin. As she left the lawyer's office, Blake felt her breath quicken for the first time in months. She walked aimlessly for a while, letting the afternoon sun warm her skin. Despite the pain and the wound that still remained open, there was something new inside her, the certainty that she wasn't doomed to be invisible. That same night, back at her house, she began packing a few belongings that truly mattered to her: photographs, notebooks with Jake's recipes, and a few blankets that reminded her of the warmth of home. She didn't need anything else. It was then that she heard about Willow Grove, a senior living community that offered independent living, daily activities, and, above all, an atmosphere of respect and belonging. She decided to visit. What she found there was a complete contrast to the coldness she'd experienced: friendly faces, inviting voices, shared tables filled with genuine laughter. For the first time since Jake's death, she felt like she could fit in again. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling her toward a new place, far from the pain she'd carried until then. At Willow Grove, Blake began to rediscover herself. She joined a book club where she shared insights with other residents, many of them with similar stories of loss and rebirth. She also tried watercolor painting classes, something she'd never imagined doing, and discovered that watching the colors blend on paper brought her peace. Little by little, mourning stopped being an unbearable burden and began to have a purpose. She was no longer just a widow dragging memories. She was now a woman rewriting chapters of her life. Friendships arrived almost without her realizing it. A neighbor invited her to walk through the gardens. Another man taught her how to tend a small community garden. There was laughter, simple conversations, and a sense of belonging that restored her lost confidence. It was on one of those days, sitting under the shade of a tree with her new friends, that Blake realized that family isn't always blood, but rather respect and companionship. And in that instant, she knew she had made the right decision: to leave behind those who had betrayed her and build a circle of genuine affection. Months passed and Blake's transformation became evident to everyone in Willow Grove. She no longer walked hunched over or stared into space. She seemed active, participating in workshops and encouraging others to share their experiences. Some residents considered her a model of resilience, without knowing the details of what had happened. She preferred not to share the full story, but deep down she knew that every smile she regained was a small victory over the humiliation she had suffered at that airport. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Mark and Tanya received an unexpected notification. The will had been amended, and they were officially excluded from any inheritance. The news hit like a bucket of cold water. Desperate emails began arriving in Blake's inbox, as well as persistent calls asking for a chance to talk or at least to keep the family house and garden. Blake, however, didn't respond. She chose silence as her response, aware that her dignity was no longer at stake and that she owed no explanations to those who had decided to discard her. Blake learned to live with that silence, which no longer hurt her, but rather gave her strength. Not opening emails, not answering calls, became a reminder that she could choose who to give space to in her life. Every morning, looking out the window of her new apartment in Willow Grove, she felt relief knowing that her future was no longer tied to anyone's manipulation. She had found a place where her voice had value, where her story was heard and respected without being used against her. If you've made it this far, tell us where you're joining us from and share this story with someone who needs to hear that there's always a new beginning. Maybe your comment will be the push someone else needs today. Over time, Blake became an important part of the community. She was the first to raise her hand to organize activities and the last to leave the common room when there were social gatherings. She had regained the energy she thought she'd lost, and many sought her out for advice or simply to share a pleasant time. She discovered she could be a support for others and that, in a way, this was also a way to honor Jake's memory, who had always valued solidarity and camaraderie. At the same time, Elder Haven began to benefit from Blake's donation. Seeing the news of new funded projects, support programs for abused elderly people, and homes renovated thanks to her legacy gave her an indescribable satisfaction. It wasn't just money, it was a clear message that the dignity of the elderly deserved to be defended. For her, every achievement of the institution was a way of transforming pain into something useful and hopeful, a way of ensuring that what had happened to her wouldn't be repeated in others. Mark and Tanya, unable to accept the loss, even showed up at Willow Grove a couple of times. They tried to get in with excuses, saying they wanted to check on me, but Blake was no longer the vulnerable woman from the airport. Standing tall, she asked them to leave from the entrance. There was no shouting or nagging, just a clear and firm boundary. Security, noticing Blake's discomfort, made sure they wouldn't bother her again. That scene, though painful, was also a confirmation. She no longer needed their approval or their presence to feel whole. The nights, once silent and heavy, began to feel different. Blake would sit in her chair with a cup of tea, looking through old photos and smiling, not at what she'd lost, but at what she'd regained within herself. The sadness for Jake was still there. But now it was accompanied by a sense of peace. She'd learned that you can grieve and move forward at the same time. What had started as a cruel abandonment ended up becoming the push that led her to rediscover herself and a new world of possibilities. With each passing day, Blake reaffirmed the idea that family isn't always measured by blood ties. At Willow Grove, she found people who listened patiently, who joined her at meals, and who celebrated her small accomplishments, like finishing a watercolor painting or reading aloud a passage from a book. That support network became her true home. What had once seemed impossible, laughing genuinely again, now happened naturally. When he received news that Mark and Tanya were still persisting, it no longer provoked pain or anger, only a kind of distant pity. They had chosen the path of ambition and contempt, and now they faced the consequences of their actions. Blake, on the other hand, had chosen the path of rebuilding and dignity, and although he knew the wound of betrayal would never completely disappear, he also understood that it wouldn't define the rest of his life. What defined his present was the peace he had built with effort and determination. One day, while walking through the garden paths of Willow Grove, Blake stopped to observe a group of residents practicing yoga outdoors. She had never thought of herself as someone who might try something like that, but that curiosity led her to join soon after. She discovered that her body, though aged, still responded with strength and flexibility. The experience reminded her that she still had so much more to live for, that being betrayed didn't mean the end of her story, but rather a new beginning filled with discovery. At the soup kitchen, some residents began calling her the lady with the new smile. That simple, affectionate nickname epitomized the transformation everyone had noticed in her. The fragile, broken woman who had arrived was barely a memory. Now, she was a silent example that life after pain is possible, and that even at 68, one can start over. Blake embraced that title with gratitude, knowing that behind every smile were scars she no longer needed to hide. Over time, Blake found the courage to share part of his story in small groups at Willow Grove. He didn't go into every detail, but he spoke of abandonment and how he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet that day at the airport. He did this not to seek pity, but to show that even in the worst of circumstances, there was a way out. Some residents, with tears in their eyes, thanked him for putting into words what they themselves had experienced in different ways. That gesture made her a discreet pillar of the community. Whenever someone new arrived, lost or scared, they would often recommend they speak to Blake. She listened without judgment, with the calm she had learned to cultivate, and offered simple but truthful words that dignity doesn't expire with age, that one can always lift one's head, and that no one deserves to be treated as a hindrance. With each conversation, Blake felt her initial pain transformed into something useful, a tool to accompany others on their own healing journey. One autumn afternoon, while painting in her watercolor studio, she received another letter from Mark in the mail. She didn't open it, she simply left it on the table and continued, brush in hand, mixing soft shades of blue and green. That seemingly small action was actually a declaration of independence. She no longer needed to read excuses or pleas. His silence was the clearest and most powerful response she could give. The past no longer dictated her decisions, and the present was filled with new choices she made herself. That same day, as she left the workshop, she found a group of neighbors organizing a community party. They invited her to help with the decorations and food preparation. Blake happily accepted, and as she hung paper garlands and tried homemade recipes, she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was confirmation that she had built a different kind of home, one made of true affection and mutual respect, something no material inheritance could buy. When the night of the party arrived, Blake found herself dancing to an old song she used to listen to with Jake. Instead of sadness, what she felt was gratitude for having had true love and for being alive to remember those moments with joy. Her new friends clapped, laughed, and cheered her on, and in that atmosphere, she realized that life hadn't taken everything from her. She still had the capacity for joy and to be part of something real. That same night, upon returning to her room, she looked at herself in the mirror carefully. She saw wrinkles she'd previously rejected, but now considered scars from experiences and lessons learned. She wasn't the broken woman who'd left the airport with a blank stare, but someone who had decided to rise up and regain her dignity. She smiled at the thought that, although Mark and Tanya had tried to reduce her to nothing, they had unintentionally given her the impetus to emerge stronger than ever. With the arrival of winter, Willow Grove was filled with lights and special activities. Blake participated in a craft workshop to make Christmas ornaments, something she had enjoyed with Jake in the past. Although she struggled to contain her nostalgia at first, she soon discovered she could create new traditions alongside the people she now considered family. The residents decorated a large tree in the center of the living room together, and when the lights came on, Blake felt like this community was the greatest gift life could give her at that time. Meanwhile, Mark and Tanya's attempts at contact continued. Emails, calls, and even messages through acquaintances arrived every week, each time sounding more desperate. But Blake no longer trembled at the sight of their names. She'd learned that protecting her peace meant keeping them out of her life. There was no hatred in her decision, only a clear and definitive boundary. That distance was her way of reminding herself that trust is too valuable a commodity to give to those who have already proven unworthy of it. At one of the book club meetings, Blake shared a reflection that emerged almost without realizing it. She said that, although she had lost much, what hurt her most was not the material absence, but the betrayal of those who should have protected her. The group listened in silence, and several nodded with pent-up tears. It was then that she realized that putting her experience into words not only freed her, but also served as comfort to others. It was like reaching out to those who still felt trapped in grief. That afternoon, upon returning to her apartment, she wrote in a notebook, "Dignity doesn't expire with age. It's strengthened by every boundary we set." She kept those words in her nightstand drawer as a personal reminder. Whenever sadness crept in, she would reread them and find the strength to move forward. Little by little, Blake realized that her life was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had decided to build from the ground up. The news that Elder Haven had opened a new center thanks to her donation was one of the most meaningful moments for Blake. Seeing images of seniors smiling, participating in activities, and receiving dignified care filled her with pride. She felt that by transforming her pain into helping others, she had come full circle. What began as an open wound at an airport ended up becoming a legacy that would protect many who, like her, had been victims of neglect. With a calmer heart, Blake understood that Jake would always be present with every step she took. His memory didn't fade, it became the force that kept her going. Now she knew that true family is one built with respect, presence, and sincere love. And as she walked the paths of Willow Grove, surrounded by new friendships and projects that filled her with life, she smiled knowing she had demonstrated something essential. It's never too late to regain your dignity and start over. Months later, when Mark and Tanya received the final legal notice excluding them from any rights to the inheritance, they tried one last time to insist with letters full of pleas and excuses. Blake didn't respond. That silence was her way of declaring that trust is a treasure that, once broken, cannot be restored. She didn't need revenge or arguments because life had already shown them the consequences of their actions. She, on the other hand, had found something far more valuable, peace and a renewed sense of belonging. Today, at 68, Blake lives surrounded by respect and companionship in Willow Grove. She participates in activities, smiles frequently, and no longer defines herself as the widow or the betrayed mother, but as a woman who decided to reinvent herself. Her story demonstrates that age is no limit, that dignity is defended until the very end, and that it is always possible to start over. And if anyone reads these words feeling abandoned or discarded, let them take them as proof that even in the midst of the worst betrayal, one can choose freedom and hope.